Welcome, intrepid historians, to this walk through the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, here Jefferson, the one people, he's referring to are Americans, the other people are the British, right? So he's saying, hey, America wants a divorce from Britain. And to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. Well, laws of nature, nature's God, this is Enlightenment philosophy, and also the religious manifestation of Enlightenment philosophy, popular among Franklin and Jefferson and other intellectuals at the time, the concept of deism, the concept of a God who, the remote watchmaker God who sets up nature and then lets the universe play out according to scientific laws. Anyhow, when people want a divorce and, America wants to be separate from Britain and equal to Britain, when this happens, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So the colonies need to explain why they want a divorce from Britain. And here they go. This is Jefferson plunging into the philosophy of John Locke. He writes, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," which means obvious, "that all men are created equal." John Locke taught about equality. "That they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? Locke had framed the natural rights as life, liberty, and property. Jefferson here improves property to pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is a reference to Locke's concept of the social contract, that the purpose of governments is to protect people's rights, to protect the natural rights people have. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. That's Locke's right of revolution. Laying the new government's foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness, which is a reiteration of the concept of the social contract, right? Governments work for us. We set up governments to keep us safe and happy, to protect our rights. Prudence is like wisdom. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. This means, overthrowing the government's a big deal, and you don't do it for little stuff, you don't do it for temporary problems. And accordingly, all experience hath shewn, that means shown, that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they're accustomed. In other words, people will put up with a lot of garbage, just to keep things the way they are. Like people like, a familiar way of life. People like a familiar form of government. However, when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Right? This last bit, a reiteration of the right of revolution, but let's work on this first bit. Long train of abuses and usurpations. He's like, Britain has been abusing us and taking away our power for a long time. So Jefferson is referring to all the different grievances that the colonists have accumulated from the Proclamation of 1763 through the course of Acts and beyond. Now, some of Britain's behavior was truly abusive and did involve taking Americans' rights, so this is partly accurate. It's also somewhat exaggerated. We've seen that the British did make an effort to compromise here and there, so this is also hyperbole. Now, this bit underlined in red is a bonkers conspiracy fantasy. Jefferson is saying the problems with Britain are not a simple difference of opinion. That Britain has always had the same object, the same goal, and it's obvious now that there is a plan, a conspiracy to reduce the colonists under absolute despotism, to take away all their freedom, to enslave them. Well, first of all, that's hyperbole. The British never intended to enslave the colonists. In fact, that makes it a lie. And there certainly was no conspiracy. I mean, the British were actually relatively transparent about what they were doing. They wanted to balance the budget of the British Empire. They wanted the colonies to help. The colonies didn't want to help, right? That's just an honest political disagreement. The colonists had a right to disagree. They had a right to resist. But you don't need to make up a conspiracy to understand why the British were doing what they were doing. It's just not necessary. I mean, you might as well hypothesize that leprechauns were behind British policy. It's equally fanciful. So Jefferson's saying, Britain's been doing us wrong for a long time. We have the right to get rid of them. Locke's right of revolution. Now, earlier he was saying people would put up with a lot before they overthrow their government, and Jefferson says, that's us. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies. Patient sufferance? I didn't feel a lot of patient sufferance when the colonists were looting the governor's mansion in Massachusetts in response to the Stamp Act. I didn't feel a lot of patient sufferance when the colonists attacked the Gaspee during the Boston Tea Party. The colonies loudly complained and protested vociferously and often violently. So calling it patient sufferance is hyperbole, if not a lie. Now, earlier, he's mentioned the right of revolution a couple times, and such is now the necessity which constrains them, right? He's saying the colonies don't have a choice here. We are forced now to exercise our right of revolution, to alter our former systems of government. And now he repeats himself. He says, the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. Before it was abuses and usurpations, now it's injuries and usurpations. He's talking about the same thing, all the colonial grievances from the proclamation of 1763 through the Revolutionary War. It's still hyperbole. Some of those were actual injuries and thefts of rights, and some of them were Britain's efforts to compromise, which were also rejected by the colonies. And he repeats the same bonkers conspiracy fantasy, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states, right? He said despotism before, he's saying tyranny now. He's basically saying the British are trying to enslave us, take away all our rights, and that's not what was happening. But Jefferson's going to prove that this is in fact what's happening. This is his boast. He says, to prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. Jefferson is describing the royal veto, right? Colonial assemblies would pass bills, and then the royal governor could agree to them if he thought they made sense, send them to the king if he thought he needed guidance from a higher power. The royal veto was rarely exercised, less than 5% of the time. So more than 95% of bills passed by colonial assemblies were approved, which makes this section hyperbole. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. right? A right they value a lot, and only a tyrant, only a dictator would not want people to have. This is a mangled reference to the Quebec Act. Quebec is the large district of people in question. And what happened in the Quebec Act is the Quebecois, the French fur traders in Quebec, who Britain had conquered in the French and Indian War, Britain asked them to stay. And so they're staying and continuing their business relationships with Native Americans. The Quebecois had asked Britain for permission to continue practicing French law at a local level and to continue living under French law at a local level and to remain Catholic. And the Quebec Act grants them that. Now, Jefferson is mischaracterizing this as Britain forcing the Quebecois to relinquish the right of representation in the legislature. In other words, to give up their right as British subjects to have representatives in a local legislature. But this wasn't a right that the Quebecois were giving up. It was a right that they had never had, right? And they were asking for permission to continue having French law locally, right? So, and moreover, not only is Jefferson claiming that they're giving up a right that they've never had, it's also like, let's imagine that we had just introduced British law in Quebec. Well, under British law, Catholics couldn't vote, and under British law, Catholics couldn't hold government office. So even, so if you had introduced British law in Quebec, the Quebecois would have had no rights anyway. So this is a really silly mischaracterization of the Quebec Act. But just wait, there's another mischaracterization of the Quebec Act coming. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. Well, that did happen a few times. It happened in Massachusetts, Virginia, and South Carolina, that Britain moved the place where the Colonial Assembly met a few miles away, and that was a hassle, and so that's a valid complaint as far as it goes. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion without and convulsions within. Yeah, sometimes colonial assemblies were sort of punished by being suspended, put out of session for a while. The most dramatic example of this being the Massachusetts Governing Act. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. Well, okay, so this first bit is about the fact that George III had thought about restricting immigration from non-British areas. There was, at this point, unlimited immigration to the 13 colonies from Britain and anywhere else in Europe. If you could get there, you were welcome. And so this is weird. I mean, actually, the British didn't impose any restrictions, and there were no legal barriers to entry. So it's an odd complaint. Now, this last bit, raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands, this is a complaint about the Proclamation of 1763, banning colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains.